Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by the fine people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
I'm caught in a weird situation. Comes about because of an article I ran across. Wisconsin is now the 50th of the 50 states to introduce right to repair laws. I started digging into this and ran across a company, Dorman Products. Dorman Products produces parts for automobiles, aftermarket parts. And what these guys do is they'll go find mechanics and people who work in, automobile factories and interview them and find out what parts are failing in cars. And Dorman will produce better parts. They'll fix whatever the failure thing is, and they market these things as aftermarket products to the extent that places like Napa are starting to only stock, or I shouldn't say only, but to stock the Dorman products instead of the original equipment manufacturer, the OEM products, because the Dorman is better. But this comes back to this right to repair legislation. And, my knee-jerk reaction to anything is we're better off without regulation as long as no one's being harmed. But, I've got a soft spot here. It really irks me when I buy something. The thing is now mine, and it's been created in such a way that if I want to get into it to repair it, I end up breaking it because it's designed to break if you attempt to get into it so that the manufacturer can sell me a new one.
Well, that does seem to me to be a harm.
Well,
it also seems to me to be a violation of your property right.
Well, not really, because I'm not required to buy the thing. The guy's selling it to me basically as is, and the as is you can't take it apart.
Yeah, but this is that same nonsense that you get every time you look at that big long list of things you have to agree to every time you use a piece of software. This is just one of those things. They say, well, you don't have to buy it if you don't agree to the terms. Well, the term is patently absurd.
Yeah, I guess the purist in me says you should just leave it to the market, but the pragmatist in me says I like this a lot.
Well, I like this because you're going to get more hate mail than me this week. Again. And I got to tell you, I took a lot of hate mail over the recent utterances I made on vaccines, so you can bet we're going to get back to that. Right. Because yet another person has died from measles in these United States. But that's for another week, because this week, Ant, we have a real tragedy on our hands. Mega Millions ticket prices are set to increase.
From what to what?
$2 to $5.
Wow, they're more than doubling.
They say a couple of things. They say that the prizes will get bigger and that more people will win. So it's kind of like toilet paper math. Do you ever see, this is the equivalent of 64 rolls of toilet paper. How can one roll of toilet paper be the equivalent of 64 rolls of toilet paper? And I think we've got more or less the same kind of nonsense here. But I wonder if this is where people finally look at it and say, well, you know what? No thanks. I mean, I doubt it. I think there's always going to be a market for this sort of thing. It's a wholly regressive tax. It hits people who can afford it least.
Yeah.
And yet they're willingly going to the store and buying these things. So, who am I to tell them they shouldn't, but they really shouldn't. And you see where all this is going to lead. People are going to end up broker than before, and the multiple states who are in on the lottery will just clear more money off it. And the occasional winner will emerge, and we'll all say, damn, I wish I was that guy.
Yeah, I'm interviewed every time the prize gets over a certain amount. I always say the same thing as you have, that it's a regressive tax in effect. But I think what's really happening here is the state, and the state has a monopoly on this, right? The state is selling the opportunity to dream.
Well, that's why I buy lottery tickets. I know I'm not going to win. I just like to think of all the people I'm going to say very upsetting things to if I do.
James is less concerned with the money than he is what he can tell people to do.
With impunity, right? I could just keep saying it and never really get in trouble ever again, which would be pretty outstanding. But of course, this brings us to the foolishness of the week. As I occasionally do, Ant, have you a guess?
Well, the episode today is DEI, so you got to top that right off.
I think I got it licked. What do Bernie Sanders, Josh Hawley, a Republican senator from Missouri, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Representative Anna Paulina Luna, Republican from Florida, have in common?
Oh, wow. I can't imagine.
They are all on board with a piece of legislation that will cap credit card interest rates at 10%.
Oh, good Lord. Come on. Again, why is it? It's like clockwork. Every 10 years, this comes back around. We got to make the same arguments all over again.
Well, you might as well just go ahead and make them, because here we are. And this time we've got two Republicans, a Democrat, and an independent / commie, all on board together. And I've said this before, when you see some kind of bipartisan support like this, you can bet your last dollar that you're looking at a lousy idea.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what happens?
You know what's going to happen? Sooner or later, these fools are going to get this legislation through. The right kind of majoritarian nonsense that, well, you know, in Trump's America, this is the kind of thing that we're going to be seeing a little more of, I think, as we go forward, as, you know, the populism kind of boils up from the bottom. Well, what's going to happen? Okay, great. Banks can only charge 10%, which they will do. And that means everybody who's not worth a credit risk will no longer get a credit card.
Yep. That's exactly right.
All the poor people will be without credit cards. And how do you figure that's going to work for them in the long run?
Oh, well, what's going to happen is those same politicians are going to turn around and say, look at these evil banks. They're discriminating on the basis of, and they'll list everything except the real reason they're discriminating, which is you're a risk that isn't worth 10%.
Yep, that's exactly what they're going to say. And then when people go to those check cashing places just to get a little bit of cash ahead of payday, well, now they're going to regulate that. And they're going to say, well, now you're leeching off the poor and you can't make a profit either, so they'll go out of business, and so on and so forth. If you want people to do well financially, you do well to get out of the markets entirely if you're the government.
Yeah.
And that will never happen. When I read this story today, it was almost as if we're in an election year already. That people are posturing for the next election. Well, great.
Yeah, it seems to never end. Completely off this topic, but am I correct? I read somewhere recently that, is it Canada or UK, one of these countries with a parliament, that its election cycle is a matter of weeks between the time they say we're going to have an election and they do, and they now have a new government.
That can happen in many parliamentary systems. It seems enlightened when you look at how long we go on and on and on, pounding on a very dead horse by the time we're near the end of the cycle. But for crying out loud, I don't even know what to say about this. This is such a profoundly bad idea that it could only be a bipartisan one.
Look, this is basic economics. It's very much akin to the tube of toothpaste. You could pound down on one place, it's going to come up in the other. You can restrict the quantity or you can restrict the price. But take your pick. And whichever one you restrict, the market's going to react on the other one. Go ahead, put a cap on the price. The market's going to pull back on the quantity.
This is an even more obvious and dumber example of the same phenomenon of surge pricing being disallowed by governments in the name of price gouging.
What we talked about on the previous episode, or one back from that New York State capped the charges for broadband, and AT&T, said, look, we can't make money, we're leaving, and now there's no broadband.
Yep, that's right. And AT&T, they're the villains.
Right, yes.
They're the bad guys here because it's never the fools who try to wrangle forces beyond their control with policy. It's never them. It's always the corporation who is there to make a profit and nothing else. Which I think dovetails nicely into what we're talking about today. But before we do, I would be remiss, Ant, if I didn't address a very, very healthy criticism that we have faced in the past week or two when it became clear that episode 420 of Words and Numbers was not about marijuana.
I know. We both missed that entirely.
What on earth were we thinking? It must have been all that weed we were smoking at the time that clouded our vision. That was such an obvious thing to do, and yet we didn't.
Yeah, we dropped the ball there.
Yeah, without question. And to all of you who have sent your very callous remarks to both of us, I would assume. Yeah, this one's on us. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. But we should go back and look at that. Some years ago, when Colorado was one of the first or among the first states to legalize marijuana, we did an episode and we wrote a couple of op-eds saying that, look, the sky is not going to fall here. Everything's going to work out fine. We should go back and revisit that. It's been some years now.
It has, and I suspect people in Colorado might sing a different song at this point. I think a lot of people who were ambivalent about legalization are now sick of the nonsense that it brings.
Oh, really?
And I think a lot of politicians are absolutely addicted to the tax revenue. I'd be interested in getting back to it myself.
Oh, what an interesting twist. That now it's the public who doesn't want it, but the politicians do.
Yeah, I mean, look, I live in a state in which marijuana is legal, and, I have a very heightened sense of smell. I can actually smell it driving down the highway. Literally every day when I'm on the roads, people around my car are smoking weed in their cars, left and right. That's really not a great thing. Now, apart from that sort of thing, would you know that we had a legal weed regime here? I don't think you would. It doesn't pop up in any other way. We have the same problems every mid-sized city has, maybe a bigger homeless problem than some, but I don't think that has much to do with the availability of legal weed.
Yeah.
I think that might have been the case in Colorado early on, where losers flocked to the state because they just wanted to get high all the time.
Yeah.
But here, I don't think that's the issue. Nonetheless, it would be interesting to get back to that one. So let's maybe stick a pin in that, see where it takes us.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
But for now, Ant, we made a promise last week that we would discuss DEI, 3 initials that we have not ever used on this podcast, I don't think. And this is the big week. So where does one begin unpacking such a profoundly horrible idea?
Well, I started by looking up some polling to see what is Pew saying about it, for example. And the questions, it's important here when you look at polls to read carefully the question that's asked. And here the headline is, and this is coming from Pew, a majority of workers say focusing on DEI at work is a good thing.
Yeah, not so fast.
Well, here's the question. It's telling us what percentage of employed adults said that, in general, focusing on increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion at work is, and then you've got good thing, bad thing, what have you. And you've got 56% of people saying mainly a good thing. Now, here's what I find fascinating about the question. Of course, the headline is 56% or a majority say DEI is good. But read the wording. It says, in general, focusing on increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion at work is mainly. So you've got 2 general qualifiers there, the in general and the mainly, yeah. And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, if I were given this question, and I'm not a huge fan of equity issues to begin with. But as I'm reading the question, and it gives the in general and the mainly, I'm focusing on the inclusion. And I'm saying, yeah, you know what? Inclusion, this is important to me. I could see responding, yeah, this is a good thing, given the qualifiers in that they're listing out separately diversity, equity, inclusion as three separate things.
I think it's even worse than that. I think that in a lot of these polls, people are presented with something like this. Are you in favor of diversity in the workplace?
Mm-hmm.
Who's going to say no to that?
Right.
Are you in favor of inclusion in the workplace? Well, it seems to be saying the same damn thing, but who's going to say no to that? Mm-hmm. Are you in favor of equitable outcomes? Anybody you know going to say no to that?
Right.
And yet you have all kinds of specialized knowledge, right? So you know what these questions are really getting at. You know how polls are constructed, and on and on and on. And even you just admitted a second ago, you might have checked off that box without even thinking about it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, what's it going to be like when regular people who don't think about this kind of thing every minute of their lives, what are they going to do? They're going to go for it every single time. And then the pollsters are going to say, meaning to say the people who commissioned the polls, meaning to say political actors who want these answers, are going to say the American people are so broadly in favor of DEI, why are we even talking about it?
Right.
And yet we know, anybody with an ounce of sense knows that that's not true. That's not true at all. And this goes back in our history for a very long while. Right? We've got a traditional problem centered right around these ideas that goes back. I mean, look, you can make the case, I think strongly so, that all of this is brought about by the once upon a time condition of slavery. Now, the honest question to ask is, how long does that continue to be a valid reason to keep chasing these things?
Mm-hmm.
At some point, you have to say, look, it's been 160 years or so. Aren't we kind of done with this? Or is this going to be a built-in problem for the rest of all time?
Yeah.
We're at the point now where I cannot meet someone who was ever enslaved, and I never enslaved anyone. Therefore, there are no victims and there are no villains anymore. Mm-hmm. There might be a condition that none of us are really responsible for. I'm ambivalent in a lot of ways in how we address that. But to say that there's a group of people who are villains and another group who are victims is wholly incorrect. Mm. That's just nonsense. And yet, here we are. You know, from the time the Civil War ended to the time of the Civil Rights Movement, we got roughly 100 years. And it's 100 pretty rough years in our history. You know, you would think that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, something we've talked about often, would have sufficed to fix the problem that we had. They didn't. Mm-hmm. They just didn't. And that problem lingered for 100 years. Well, okay, then it was time for the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights era, if you prefer. And we get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with the introduction of this thing, and affirmative action. Notice what it's called. Affirmative action. Who could be against an action that is affirmative?
Right.
What kind of heartless, soulless wretch would you have to be? But there were a group of people back at the time who said, you know, if you pass this into law, there will be quotas. There will be hiring quotas all across the country. And Hubert Humphrey, who championed this bill like no one ever championed anything, famously said, if you can find quotas in this bill, I'll eat my hat. Well, the ink wasn't dry on the page, and companies were coming up with, and governments were coming up with quota systems. Mm-hmm. Why? How else would you know you were successful?
Right.
You have to count X before, and then you have to count X after, and the after result has to be better than the before result. And the only way is to count. Mm-hmm. And the minute you start counting, congratulations, now you've got quotas. Because how else will you know what to aim for? Well, the American people put up with this for a long time. They didn't like it, but they put up with it because they knew in their hearts there had been a real problem, and they didn't want to be part of a continued problem. So, okay. But by the time I'm in graduate school in the 1990s, affirmative action was a hot button issue, and it had all but run its course. And that was in the mid-90s. By the late 90s, you see it falling apart everywhere. It gets beaten back at the Supreme Court level, right? It's getting dismantled everywhere you can find it. Mm-hmm. And what is the radical American left to do then? They come up with this brand new and completely unrelated idea. It had nothing to do with affirmative action. No, this is completely different. It was called multiculturalism. Do you remember that one?
Yeah.
And who could be against multi meaning many and culturalism meaning many cultures? Yes, that's a good thing. Sure. Yeah, except it had all of the exact same goals, maybe with a couple of more tacked on, as affirmative action had, and affirmative action had just died a few years before. So what do you know? Multiculturalism dies kind of a stillbirth in a lot of ways, does some damage for a while and just disappears. And then, as if by magic, some years later, DEI shows up. I ask you, Ant, how is DEI different from affirmative action?
No, it's not. It's got flashier packaging.
It's nice that you would speak the absolute, utter truth of the matter. It's not any different. Well, okay. Do we need it? I guess that would be the only question to ask, right? Because if the answer to that is yes, well, I guess we're going to have to say maybe we will always need it. Are the minorities living among us somehow so incapable that they can't succeed without something like this? Or is it the case that the white majority is so horrible that this outcome is preordained? Because those are the only two possibilities.
When you talked about diversity, you said, who can be against it? You talked about affirmative action. Who could be against that? The word. Multiculturalism, same thing. Who could be against it? And in all three cases, and I think so too with this Pew survey that I'd looked at, it's phrased as a good thing. Of course you want diversity. Of course you want multiculturalism, so on and so forth. What's not stated anywhere is at what cost. And that becomes the problem, I think, when people look around, and I observed it firsthand when I would sit on more than one faculty hiring committee. And somebody on the committee would invariably say something like, and I'm paraphrasing, but the words are pretty close to what the person actually would say. First thing I did is I went through the resumes and I took out all the males, or I took out all the whites, or whatever it was, so that we can look only at whoever the favored class is that they want to look at. And that's the cost, is you're now, in what you perceive as pursuing a justice, you're actually imposing a tremendous injustice on other people.
And that's fine if those other people are the people that brought about the injustice.
Right, yes. If they're somehow guilty, yes.
As a remedy, I'm all in favor of that sort of thing. But when you look at people and you say, I know you haven't done anything wrong, but somebody who looks like you did once upon a time, so you're going to have to pay. Mm-hmm. That doesn't sit right with me at all. I mean, not at all. So where does that leave me? I've got a couple of things here that they're really hard to square. And I can tell you, Ant, when I was out on the job market in the academy, I would every now and again have to write up a diversity statement. Do you even know what that is?
I just missed it. I missed it by maybe 2 years. So you're like a couple years younger than I am. I didn't have to do that ever.
You mean, think about this, a diversity statement. What am I supposed to write?
Right, yeah. You're teaching political philosophy. What kind of diversity are they looking for?
I mean, there's all kinds of good diversity. Then there's all kinds of lousy diversity. I mean, we don't want Nazis coming in, right? Mm-hmm. I would say Marxists, but colleges love Marxists for some reason. But okay, we can at least all agree that Nazis are terrible. Should we be open to the possibility of a Nazi political scientist? Well, given that nobody's open to the possibility of a Republican political scientist, I suspect that's out of the question. Right? I mean, there's an old observation, I think it was Thomas Sowell, who said, if you want to talk to me about diversity, show me how many Republicans are in your sociology department. Mm-hmm. That's not a bad idea, actually, because at the university level, what diversity really means is a black progressive, a white progressive, a lesbian progressive, a Hispanic progressive. There's only that kind of diversity.
Right.
Diversity of viewpoint, that doesn't exist anywhere.
Which is ironic, given that the whole product of the university is thought and ideas.
Right. And this is so obviously true that no one would dare contradict me. Mm-hmm. They would prefer I didn't make this argument. They would prefer nobody thought about these things, but nobody would dare say I'm wrong.
Yep.
And that's really telling. So how far can we go holding one group of people accountable for another group of people's misery? That's an actual honest question. Mm-hmm. I don't know the answer to that. I don't think we can do it at all. But I only think we can't do it at all if everything we do has to be part of the grievance Olympics. Where do I get my jersey? Because I want to start claiming that I've been done wrong. Well, not me, but people who look like me, and not in this lifetime, but 8 or 10 generations ago, and it has a lasting effect on me right now here. So, what am I entitled to? When you look at the United States, what you often see is a country doing its level best to do the right thing. It's hard to do the right thing. We get confused as a people. We get sidetracked. We do all kinds of things that are suboptimal. And yet, at the end of the day, until very recently, and we'll have to see how present day contemporary history plays out, but anytime you were looking for the morally courageous attitude on the world stage, you looked to the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's pretty good. I mean, that's really good. And yet, it's never enough. I would like to know when it will finally be enough, because one thing I've noticed, and you have too, if you did even a moderate amount of digging around on this DEI business, company after company after company, they're dropping this like a hot potato.
Yes.
Everywhere you look, there's another company saying, you know what, not anymore. Mm-hmm. Because it's not helpful to them as corporations to do this. If it were, they would do it voluntarily and they'd never even talk about it. Mm-hmm. They would just do it. But now they're saying, not only are they talking about it, they're talking about it in the negative, and every corporation that you look at is walking as far away from this as they can, as fast as they can. There will still be a few that don't, and I think that's fine, as long as your shareholders permit it. Knock yourselves out. The owner of the company, he gets that call, and if the owner is a group of shareholders, then that's fine too. But I don't want to invest in a company that expends loads of resources trying to accomplish this.
Well, more than that, I wouldn't want to work there.
I want them to expend loads of resources trying to make a profit, which is what a business is for. It's not for meting out some form of hand-fisted social justice.
Yeah, and remember, for those who are squeamish about profit, remember what this means. A company that is laser-focused on profit is, by definition, laser-focused on satisfying the customer, because that's how you get profit.
That's right. That's right. And one of the ways you satisfy customers is by treating people with respect.
Yeah.
All across the board, right? Most companies don't have to be told this. Mm-hmm. Some do, but most don't, because it kind of goes without saying.
Those that need to be told it end up either learning it quickly or going out of business.
Yeah, the only large group of people dedicated to a common cause who don't have to learn this are government employees.
Yeah.
That's literally true.
Let me point out something here, because you asked several times, how much is enough? How long until we're done with this? I submit that the answer is never. And the reason the answer is never is because the people who promote DEI and DEI-like things, and by promote, I don't mean people who are necessarily just for it, but people at the top who are the organizers, who make a living from this sort of thing. They have an incentive to make sure that relations between minorities and majorities are never healed. Because the moment those relations are healed, those people are out of work.
They have an absolute vested interest in keeping this rolling right along. And you've heard me before refer to the civil rights industry in the United States rather than the civil rights movement, right? Because it is an industry now. People's carts are attached to this horse. Therefore, there can be no end to the struggle. But here's an interesting question for you, Ant. We're quickly coming up to a time when white people will be a minority in the country.
Yes.
We are quickly coming to that. What happens then?
Right.
Do they remain the villain forever?
Oh, I'm pretty sure they do. And I point for evidence to, what is this new term? White adjacent?
What the hell?
When people point out, for example, the argument, well, minorities don't have a decent opportunity here and so on and so forth, and people point to Asians who outstrip whites in terms of education, in terms of income. In fact, you and I had written an op-ed on this a couple of years ago as an empirical response to this claim that women are paid less, that minorities are paid less. And we looked at the data broken down by gender and by race. And what gender/race earns by far the highest wage in the United States? It's Asian women.
And having known a bunch of them, I'm not the least bit surprised.
So to answer your question, we're already at this point where I've heard Asians referred to as white adjacent, or in other words, they're not really minorities. And so when whites become a minority, whites will still not be minorities, not really.
They have the soul of a majority, even if they're a numeric minority.
Right.
So we might as well keep going right down that same tired old road. But up until recently, I would have said we're getting to the point, but I think we've gotten to the point where you just can't get any more out of that horse.
You can't. And, you talk about the civil rights industry, and we've observed, you and I, as we've gone to high schools throughout the country, we've seen firsthand the relationships amongst white and black students in classrooms, in public schools in this country. Now, of course, we're only seeing them for one day, but we are seeing them actually interacting. Remarkably, they're just a bunch of students put together. It's not like when you and I were in school and there was a clear delineation between the white students, the black students, this kind of thing. You don't see any of that. I didn't see any of that. And that tells me that the civil rights industry now, given that race relations are, of course, they're not perfect, but they're way better than they were in the past, so the civil rights industry is going to insist that they aren't.
Well, it has to keep doing that, or it goes out of business.
Right. They're going to be, in effect, perpetrating a fraud and saying that we have a problem when, in fact, we don't.
I think ultimately that's right. And I'll take my foot off the gas for a minute and say I suspect that we still have enough by way of racial tension that we might want to address it somehow. But addressing it in a way that dumps more gasoline onto that fire is probably not the way to go.
Yeah. And here I love Morgan Freeman has a great quote. The actor, Mike Wallace on 60 Minutes, asked him this same question. So what should we do about race relations? What can we do to improve them? And he says, quit talking about race.
Not a bad way to go, because we've gotten to the point now, people forget how important this reality is. We've gotten to a point now where people aren't being lynched.
Do you say aren't?
Are not being lynched. That's right.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And I've said before that I fully believe my black fellow citizens when they say that they're not treated well by the police. I believe it.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are all kinds of problems that we face as a society. But is having any sort of quota for anything the way to address that? Is that what promotes healing in any way?
Mm-hmm.
And I would submit that it does not. That it actually does more harm than good. And when you ask the question, when will it end? Well, the only answer to that question is never. And if the honest answer is never, then it has to end right now, today. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time,
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.